Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. In a huge gray stone mansion, perched on a solitary hill overlooking Lake Geneva, lived Charles-Henri Belmont, a man whose fortune spanned 3 continents, but whose heart had gradually shrunk. The place, once conceived as a dream home, now resembled a silent mausoleum. Its corridors echoed with emptiness, and the thick, often drawn curtains filtered the light as if to keep the outside world at bay. At 60, Charles-Henri had seen the best in men, but above all, the worst. In his youth, he had believed in loyalty, in friendship, in the nobility of intentions. He had believed that success attracted sincere smiles. But the years had slowly disillusioned him. He had seen associates manipulate his projects in the shadows for their own gain. Family members reach out one way and stab the other. Servants steal discreetly. Friends become absent at the first setback. Money, instead of offering him freedom, had offered him invisible chains, those of permanent suspicion. He had built an empire for himself, but also an inner fortress made of silence, mistrust, and well-organized solitude. His only faithful presences were Francois, his butler in service for 30 years, discreet, loyal, almost invisible, Balthazar, an old Newfoundland dog with a tired look, and the cameras, omnipresent in every room, every corridor, every corner of the estate. Everything in this mansion reflected the Charles-Henri paradox, a life of luxury and power, but devoid of human warmth. One January morning, as the snow fell silently like heavenly dust, Madame Keller, the director of a high-end domestic service agency, appeared at the door. She was wearing a formal suit and carrying a notebook of recommendations. Beside her, a slim, upright woman with a deep gaze waited silently. "Mr. Belmont, I present to you Alma Kovacevic," says Ms. Keller confidently. She is trained at prestigious hotels in Zurich and Lucerne. Very professional, discreet, resistant to pressure. Charles-Henri sat up in his leather chair. He stared at the woman in front of him without saying a word. Alma was about 30 years old. Her hair was tied up simply, her clothes sober, without coquetry. What was most striking was his gaze, both calm and determined, without a hint of flattery or the greed that Charles-Henri knew only too well. His hands, rough and damaged, spoke of a past of hard work. "Where are you from?" he finally asked, in a deep, almost dry voice. "From Sarajevo, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "And you live?" "In Geneva. I send part of my salary to my mother, who's back there. She's sick. I have 2 jobs, but I'm willing to quit the other one if you need me full-time." His voice was calm. No pleading, no pathos. Just a fact said with dignity. "Have you ever worked in a house this big?" he asked, sweeping the room with a gesture. "No, sir, but I learned quickly." Charles-Henri looked deep into her eyes. He was looking for a tremor. Fear? Lust? Both read only polite neutrality there, a discreet but sincere curiosity. She looked at old paintings, gilded moldings, oriental rugs not as trophies, but as elements of a workplace. He felt annoyance rising within him. He didn't like being thrown off balance. And yet, this woman was neither submissive nor distant. She was, right there, whole, silent, solid. He nodded towards Francois. "Show her around. Let her start tomorrow." Then, turning to Alma, "People here tend to change over time. You too, I suppose." She answered without hesitation. "It's possible, but not always in the way you expect." Charles-Henri stood there for a moment. He jotted this sentence down in a corner of his memory. He hired him, not out of enthusiasm, but out of weariness, out of curiosity, perhaps, or out of that tired intuition that sometimes awakens despite the walls. But this time, he was going to check. A week after his arrival, Alma had imposed herself on the routine of the manor with an almost invisible precision. She moved like an orderly shadow between the rooms, punctual like a Swiss clock, rigorous without rigidity. She spoke only when necessary, and her words, chosen with care, were clear, without affectation. Each gesture seemed matured by ancient form of respect, as if each object carried within it a story that only silence could honor. She polished the frames without ever disturbing their tilt. She changed the sheets without rustling the air around the bed. She cleaned the hall floor as if it were a temple. Francois, the butler, watched her from a distance, intrigued by her constancy. Never a sigh, never a lingering glance at the wealth that surrounded her. She worked without trying to please, without trying to escape either. But Charles Henri, himself, remained skeptical. He had learned to be wary of the masks of discipline. He knew that people's patience was a facade. He had seen servants who were impeccable for months before an irreparable gesture betrayed them. For him, true human nature was revealed only in the presence of naked temptation, brutal, without witnesses. So, he decided to orchestrate a test. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky was gray. A dense fog had landed on the estate, as if even nature wanted to hide what was about to happen. In his mahogany and leather-upholstered desk, Charles Henri gently opened the large safe built into the wall, hidden behind a masterpiece. He left the door slightly ajar, enough so that the wealth it contained was apparent at a glance. Inside, perfectly arranged bundles of bills, several antique jewelry with precious stones, and above all, a thick brown envelope, unsealed. It contained ultra-confidential documents relating to a mining dispute in Africa, an explosive case that could influence the decision of the international court and potentially be worth hundreds of millions. Information of this nature, in the wrong hands, could change a life or ruin several. Before leaving the room, Charles Henri carefully checked the surveillance camera's 3 angles, all clear. One of them pointed directly at the trunk. He set the system for continuous, silent capture. No automatic zoom, just the cold, objective gaze of the machine. Then he went out, taking care to announce that he would be absent all morning. He left Alma alone in the house, as was his custom on Tuesdays when Francois was in charge of shopping in town. Around 10:15 a.m., Alma entered the office, dressed as always in a perfectly ironed gray apron, a low bun, sleeves carefully rolled up. She began her work as she did every Tuesday. First the windows, which she cleaned silently, her movements slow and circular, like a kind of ritual. Then the desk, which she dusted with a soft cloth. She passed the shelves filled with old leather-bound books, then came to the slightly displaced painting. She stopped. His gaze slowly moved down to the half-open trunk door. His body didn't move an inch for several seconds. Time seemed to stand still. She approached. Slowly. No panic, no rush. Just an almost clinical calm. Light sound of his footsteps on the parquet floor echoed in the silence of the office. Arriving in front of the trunk, she leaned forward slightly. The cameras captured every micro-expression. First, silent surprise, then a brief contraction of the eyebrows. She saw the bills, the jewels, the brown envelope. Her gaze lingered a little longer on it. For a moment, her gaze seemed to be lost in something greater, as if she perceived the invisible trap stretched in this absurd opening. Then, slowly, she closed the trunk door with an almost maternal caution, without ever touching its contents. She took a moment to look around the room, as if to check that she was alone. Then she took out a small crumpled notebook from the pocket of his blouse, tore out a piece of paper, and, with a black pen, wrote in neat, straight handwriting. Mr. Belmont, the safe in your office was open this morning. I closed it as a precaution. Nothing appears to have been moved. Alma. She folded the paper in half, without haste, and walked to the door of the master bedroom. She slipped the note under the door, paused for a moment, as if to make sure that the silence of the manor hid no witnesses. Then, she returned to her work, as if nothing had happened. Charles Henri watched the scene in his private office, lit by the cold light of the screens. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, but he paid no attention. His eyes were fixed on the recording, his hands clasped in front of his lips. He watched Alma enter the office, her step light and measured. He observed every detail. The barely perceptible frown, the way she leaned forward, the silence in her gaze. This almost supernatural calm in the face of what others would have seen as an invitation to steal. He replayed the scene 3 times. 4. He expected a shiver of temptation, a movement toward a bill, a finger brushing a jewel, even furtively, a heartbeat betrayed by the body. But there was nothing, just a woman who discovered an open chest, and who, with disarming simplicity, closed what she should never have seen. No curiosity, no trouble, not even a trace of envy. He stood up and took a few steps into the room. A part of him was stirring, a dull anger, directed not at Alma, but at himself. Because deep down, he had wanted her to fail. to confirm once again that humanity was nothing but controlled greed. He had prepared himself for betrayal with the resignation of a broken man. And yet, she had deprived him of that certainty, and it upset him. That evening, he passed her in the main hallway near the library. She was carrying a stack of freshly ironed towels. When she saw him, she stopped and gave a slight bow, an almost ancient habit, without submission or servility. A form of silent respect. "Good evening, sir," she said simply. He stared at her for a few seconds. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He contented himself with a slow, serious nod. His gaze that evening was a silent thank you, more loaded with truth than all his conversations of the last 20 years. A week passed. The cold thickened around the manor. Snow now covered the garden like a soft, silent, thick, almost unreal blanket. The stone paths and the outline of the central fountain were no longer visible. The world seemed suspended in a white silence. That morning, Alma, upon entering her room, found on the bedside table a small, old wooden box. Dark wood, weathered by the years, finely hand-carved with delicate floral motifs. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside rested a Baltic amber necklace, composed of polished oval stones of a deep, almost living honey hue. The whole was placed on a bed of black velvet. A burst of natural light made the amber sparkle, revealing fossilized inclusions, as if the memory of the world was imprisoned in this jewel. Under the collar, an old-fashioned envelope, sealed with a red wax seal. She broke it carefully. The letter inside was written in fine, slanted handwriting with a quill. "Alma, all my life, I've been testing people. I've set traps more than I've trusted. And I've been disappointed, systematically, to the point of believing it was the natural order of things. But you have proven to me that silence can contain more loyalty than 1,000 declarations. That righteousness needs no witnesses. This isn't a test you've passed. It's a mirror you've held up to me. And in that reflection, for the first time in a long time, I saw my own bitterness. I'm not offering you this necklace as a reward. I'm offering it as a symbol, a recognition, a word I no longer know how to say otherwise. I would like you to stay here, no longer as an employee, but as general manager of this house. Not because you are competent, I already knew that, but because you are worthy. With my respect, Charles-Henri Belmont." Alma slowly closed the letter. Her face betrayed no strong emotion, but she held the necklace up to the light, as if searching for its heart. Then she closed the box, placed it delicately on the table, and went to the kitchen as she did every morning. She wasn't used to spectacular gestures, but in her steps, now, there was a new lightness, as if an invisible weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. Years passed. Alma remained. She never really left the manor, and in her own way, she became its beating heart. The old estate, perched on the snowy hill, once frozen in silence and solitude, began to breathe differently. What was once a museum of memories frozen in stone became a living place. One could hear again the sound of light footsteps, the breath of a crackling fire, the clinking of pans, and above all, sometimes, laughter. Yes, laughter, which echoed like forgotten music in the long marble corridors. Charles-Henri, on the other hand, changed. Slowly, subtly, but profoundly. As the seasons passed, he found himself going down to the kitchen for no reason, listening to Alma's simple stories, commenting on the rain or the sweetness of a dish. He rediscovered the pleasure of the present, the one that expects nothing, that no longer distrusts everything. Solitude was no longer a barrier, but a choice he could make or abandon. He began to read more, and sometimes to write. He found old letters, long forgotten, and even a notebook of poems he had begun in his youth, proof that he had once believed in the beauty of things. Sometimes he read them aloud, and Alma listened to him in silence, while ironing clothes or making tea. And then, little by little, the doors of the manor opened to the outside world. At first, shyly, a village child invited to taste an apple pie on the terrace. Then 2, then 5. Children who, on Wednesdays, came to run in the large garden, play hide-and-seek between the trimmed hedges, draw with chalk on the old stones in the courtyard. The children's laughter, this pure sound, became a habit. Alma prepared snacks. Charles-Henri observed from afar at first, then more closely. One day, he even told them a story, sitting on a bench, his wrinkled face lit up with a discreet but sincere smile. He was no longer just the rich old man locked away in his ivory tower. He became a name whispered respectfully in the village, a benevolent legend, almost an unexpected grandfather. And in a wing of the manor, the safe remained there, unchanged. Still in its place, firmly anchored to the stone wall, its thick door firmly closed. But it was no longer watched, no longer tested. The camera that once pointed at it had long since been moved, replaced by a small shelf of books and a houseplant. No, the safe wasn't locked for fear of being stolen. It wasn't even important anymore, because something far more precious than what it contained, trust, had taken his place in Charles Henri's heart. And trust, when it is true, no longer needs proof nor traps. It does not need locks nor keys. She lives in discreet gestures, peaceful silences, and loyalty that is not spoken, but which is felt, known, and respected. Sometimes, on winter evenings, Charles Henri would sit by the large bay window in the living room, a blanket on his knees, a book in his hands. Alma would pass by, wordlessly placing a cup of tea on the table. The old dog slept at her feet. The fire danced in the fireplace. So, in those moments, he told himself that everything he had owned, the gold, the contracts, the estates in Dubai or Singapore, had never had as much value as a dignified look, a spoken word, or a meaningful silence. And he closed his eyes, peaceful, reconciled with the world.